The harsh truth, family, doesn't always mean love. Sometimes it means betrayal, polished with silver cutlery and dressed up in holiday smiles. Evelyn Hart knew this truth better than most. She stood at the edge of the long driveway leading to her son's countryside estate, clutching a simple white box to her chest as if it contained her very heartbeat. Snow fell in gentle flakes, painting the fields around her in untouched white. But the beauty did nothing to ease the weight pressing down on her chest. Inside the box was the quilt she had stitched by hand, every square cut from one of her late husband's shirts. The soft blue flannel he wore to fix the fence. The crisp white button-up from their anniversary dinner. Even the faded green one with a faint coffee stain on the collar. Each piece had been sewn with careful hands and aching memory. It wasn't just fabric. It was her way of carrying her husband back into the house that was supposed to still feel like family. She lifted her head and looked at the house. The estate rose tall and wide, its windows glowing with golden light, the sound of laughter spilling out into the night air. From the outside, it looked like the perfect Christmas. Warmth, joy, family. But Evelyn knew better. She had been inside this house enough times to know the warmth was not for her. Still, she walked forward. Because mothers don't stop trying, even when every step feels like walking into enemy territory. At the doorstep, the heavy oak door swung open before she could knock. There stood Clara Jennings, her daughter-in-law. Clara's smile was polished, practiced, the kind worn by people who smile with their lips, but not their eyes. "Oh, Evelyn," Clara said, her voice sweet as frosting, but sharp as glass. "You made it after all." Evelyn shifted the box in her arms and forced a small smile. "Of course. It's Christmas." Clara's eyes flicked down at the box, and one perfectly arched brow lifted. "Another one of your little projects?" she asked lightly, the words floating like a feather, but cutting like a knife. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She simply nodded. "Something I thought might add to the evening." Clara stepped aside with a graceful gesture, letting her mother-in-law in, but her presence filled the doorway like a warning sign. Evelyn brushed past, feeling the familiar sting settle deep in her chest. Inside, the house was glowing with decorations. A tall Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner, its ornaments gleaming like jewels. The table in the dining room was already set, shining with crystal glasses and plates that looked like they belonged in a museum. Everything was curated, spotless, staged for the perfect picture. Evelyn's gift, the quilt, already felt out of place. The coat among coats, she followed Clara to the coat rack in the hallway. Evelyn carefully hung her old wool coat, its edges frayed, its color faded with years of winters. Around it hung fur jackets, sleek leather, and heavy designer coats that whispered of wealth and youth. Her coat sagged among them like a tired elder forced to stand beside queens. Evelyn looked at it for a long moment. That coat had carried her through nights when she worked double shifts, mornings when she walked Daniel to school, storms when she had no umbrella and no car. It wasn't fashionable, but it had been faithful. Just like her. She placed the box holding the quilt on the small side table. For a moment, she ran her fingers over the ribbon, reminding herself why she had brought it. It wasn't for Clara. It wasn't even for the rest of the family. It was for Daniel, to remind him of his father, to remind him of the love that had once been the foundation of their family. But deep inside, Evelyn feared he wouldn't see it that way. Eyes that avoid from the hallway, she caught sight of Daniel. He stood across the room, surrounded by guests, laughing too loudly at something one of Clara's cousins had said. His suit was sharp, his posture confident, but Evelyn saw something else. Nervousness in his shoulders, unease in the way his eyes darted around the room. He must have seen her. For a split second, his gaze locked on hers, and then he looked away, as if she were just another guest, another obligation, another shadow in the corner of the glittering house. The sharpness of that moment made Evelyn's heart ache. In her mind, she saw another Daniel, the boy who used to run across the yard into her arms after school, his backpack bouncing, his voice shouting, "Mom! Mom!" She remembered the way he used to slip little notes into her apron pocket when she baked pies, notes that said things like, "I love you more than cake." Now, that boy was gone. Replaced by a man who couldn't even meet her eyes, Evelyn steadied herself. She had learned long ago how to live with silence. But tonight, she felt it pressing harder than usual. The distant seat. When the call to dinner came, Evelyn walked slowly toward the dining table. The seats had already been arranged, and Clara guided her to the farthest end, beside a distant cousin she barely knew, and a woman whose name Evelyn could never remember. The main conversations flowed at the other end. Near Clara and Daniel, where the light seemed brighter, the wine poured more freely and the laughter overlapped like a chorus. Evelyn's seat, though, felt like exile. She placed her napkin on her lap and folded her hands in silence. Around her, the family buzzed with chatter, stories of vacations, new jobs, expensive gifts. No one asked Evelyn how she had been. No one asked about her quilt. No one asked anything at all. She felt herself becoming invisible. A guest in her own son's house. A relic at the edge of a family she had sacrificed everything to build. But Evelyn did not bow her head. She sat tall, her back straight, her eyes steady. She told herself what she had told herself 1,000 times before. I belong here. Even if they don't see it, I belong. And so the night began. A mother seated at the far end of her own legacy, holding her silence like armor, unaware of the storms that were about to break over her. The whispered jokes. The first bite of dinner had barely been taken when the whispers began. They started quietly, like small cracks forming in glass, easy to miss if you weren't listening. But Evelyn had learned to listen. She always heard the whispers, even when no one thought she could. One cousin leaned across the table and asked, "Does Evelyn still make those little, what do you call them, quilts?" Another chuckled under his breath. "Oh yes, she's committed to the craft. I saw one last year. It looked like something out of a garage sale." Evelyn kept her eyes on her plate, cutting her turkey with care. She didn't flinch, didn't respond. Years of silence had taught her how to sit through the stings. She told herself, they don't matter. I didn't come here for them, but the words still landed. Each one a reminder that in this room full of polished shoes and diamond earrings, her life's work was just a punchline. Clara's performance. Clara noticed the whispers, and she seized them like a performer grabbing the spotlight. She stood slightly, her wine glass catching the light as she spoke loudly enough for the table to hear. "Oh, Evelyn," she said sweetly, "you are still making your little projects, aren't you?" Her tone dripped with false warmth, but her eyes glittered with something sharper. The guests chuckled, some nervously, some eagerly. Clara had a way of pulling people into her performance, making them complicit in her cruelty. Evelyn raised her head slowly. Her voice was soft but steady. "Yes, I made something for tonight, actually." The room quieted slightly, curiosity stirring. Clara tilted her head, lips curling in mock delight. "Oh, well, let's not keep the suspense. What masterpiece do we have this year?" The gift, revealed Evelyn, reached for the box she had placed carefully on the side table when she arrived. She lifted it gently, almost reverently, and set it on the table before her. With hands that trembled only slightly, she untied the pale ribbon and unfolded the tissue paper. Inside lay the quilt, soft, stitched with care, every square a fragment of her past. She lifted it slowly, letting the fabric unfurl across her arms. "This," she said quietly, "is made from Daniel's father's shirts. Each piece holds a memory, Sunday mornings, birthdays, the last Christmas we spent together. I thought it might bring warmth to this table." Her voice faltered for a moment, but she steadied it. She wanted them to see, not the fabric, but the love woven into it. Some guests looked touched, their eyes softening for a brief second. But Clara was quicker. She stepped forward, her smile sharp as a blade. Cruelty in red heels, Clara reached out, pinching the quilt between two manicured fingers as though it were something distasteful. She held it up for the room to see, her laughter light but laced with venom. "Look at this," she said, turning it so everyone could see, straight out of Grandma's attic. "How charming." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved around the table. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Then Clara let it slip from her fingers. The quilt landed softly on the polished floor. Evelyn's breath caught. Before she could bend to retrieve it, Clara lifted her red stiletto heel and pressed it down firmly onto the fabric. The pointed heel dug into the soft cotton, pinning it to the ground as if crushing the memory beneath her shoe. "You want us to keep this as a legacy?" Clara spat lightly, still smiling for the audience. "Take your nostalgia, Evelyn." "It belongs in the past." The room froze. Some laughed nervously. Others looked away. The only sound was the faint clinking of silverware being set down. A mother's dignity. Daniel sat at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on his plate. He didn't look up. He didn't speak. His silence was louder than Clara's cruelty. Evelyn's chest burned. For a moment she thought she might break, that tears might spill in front of them all. But then something older, stronger, rose inside her. She pushed her chair back slowly. The sound of wood against the polished floor cut through the silence. With calm movements, she bent down and lifted the quilt from the ground. Her fingers brushed over the fabric, tracing the mark Clara's heel had left, a crescent-shaped bruise on memory. She shook the fabric gently, brushing off the dirt as though she were cleaning an old photograph. Her hands trembled, but not from weakness. From power, from restraint. She folded the quilt carefully, smoothing it with her palms and placed it back in the box. Then she returned to her seat without a word. The room remained still. No one dared speak. Evelyn sat tall, her silence wrapping around her like armor. Inside, though, her heart ached. Every stitch she had sewn was heavy with love, and tonight it had been trampled underfoot. But she held her silence, because silence sometimes is the only dignity left. And so the first cracks widened. A mother humiliated in front of her own family, her gift crushed beneath red heels, while her son watched in silence. She said nothing, but in her silence, something began to shift, something no one at that table could yet see. The bakery days, the clatter of forks and the low hum of conversation in the dining room faded into the background as Evelyn's mind drifted. She was no longer in Daniel's grand estate. She was back in a small brick building on the east side of town, Harper's Hearth Bakery. The air there had always smelled of cinnamon, sugar, and fresh bread. The counters had been polished by her hands, the glass display always filled with pies, rolls, and cakes she baked before dawn. That bakery had been her second chance at life after her husband's passing. It was her way of surviving and building something from nothing. She remembered the day Clara first walked in, years younger, wearing too much eyeliner and carrying herself with a defiant tilt of the chin. She had applied for a cashier position, her resume thin, her references shaky. Evelyn had looked into her eyes and seen something familiar, a girl on the edge, desperate for a chance. "Have you ever worked a register before?" Evelyn had asked. "Of course," Clara lied smoothly, though her hesitation gave her away. Evelyn should have said no. She should have chosen someone more reliable, but she hadn't. Instead, she had smiled softly and said, "I believe everyone deserves a second chance. You can start on Monday." For weeks, Evelyn taught Clara how to greet customers, how to count change, how to smile even when she didn't feel like it. For a time, Clara did well. Customers liked her quick wit, and she had a way of convincing people to buy an extra cinnamon roll or slice of pie. But then came the nights when the register didn't balance. The first time, Evelyn thought it was her mistake. The second time, she wondered if one of the evening workers had forgotten to count carefully. But by the third time, she knew. One evening, she stayed late, hidden in the kitchen with flour still dusting her apron. She watched through the crack in the door as Clara slid 2 20s from the drawer into her apron pocket. No hesitation, no guilt, just the smooth confidence of someone who had done it before. "Clara," Evelyn said softly, stepping out. Clara froze. "Sit down," Evelyn said, pointing to a small table in the corner. She poured tea for both of them, her hands steady though her heart ached. "I could call the police," Evelyn said quietly, sliding the steaming cup across the table. "You could end up with a record before your life even begins." Clara stared at the floor, jaw tight. She didn't apologize. She didn't cry. Instead, she muttered, "You wouldn't." Evelyn looked her in the eye, seeing the arrogance beneath the fear. And she made her choice. "No," Evelyn said finally. "I won't. But don't mistake my silence for weakness." She didn't fire Clara. She gave her another chance. A chance Clara never deserved. And now, years later, the same girl she had protected stood in Evelyn's son's house, mocking her, crushing her quilt under her heel. The lawyer's office. The memory of the bakery dissolved into another scene, a quiet office with polished mahogany shelves. It had been years ago, after Evelyn had bailed Daniel out of his first business collapse. She had gone to see her lawyer, Anthony Wells, a patient man with silver hair and a calm voice. "I want to protect what little I have left," Evelyn had told him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Anthony had nodded, listening carefully. "We can set up a trust, make sure your assets are protected." "What exactly are you worried about?" Evelyn hesitated. She didn't want to speak Clara's name out loud. Instead, she said, "I'm worried about people who mistake kindness for weakness. I'm worried about what happens if I'm disrespected, humiliated in the very family I built." Anthony tilted his head. "You want protection not just for your money, but for your dignity." "Yes," Evelyn whispered. "If the time comes when I am openly shamed, I want the power to take back everything I gave." And so the emotional equity clause was born. It was unconventional, almost unheard of in legal circles. But Anthony had drafted it carefully. If Evelyn were ever publicly ridiculed or humiliated, with proof, then all assets, shares, and properties tied to her name would revert back to her, immediately, irrevocably. When she signed the papers, Evelyn felt a strange calm settle over her. She had built her life on silence, on patience, on endurance. But now she carried something stronger, a safeguard no one knew about. Sacrifices remembered. Her gaze shifted across the dining room table back in the present, landing on Daniel. He was still silent, still pretending not to notice the tension at the far end of the table. Evelyn's chest tightened as memories flooded in. She remembered patching his jeans late at night by candlelight because she couldn't afford to buy new ones. She remembered clapping the loudest at his school play, even when her hands were raw from working double shifts. She remembered staying up all night nursing him through a fever, whispering prayers into the darkness. She remembered the way he once leaned into her shoulder after his first heartbreak, whispering, "You're all I've got, Mom." And later, when his business collapsed and debts threatened to drown him, she had quietly saved him. She had funneled the money through the trust, making him the operational head, even though it had cost her years of savings and countless sacrifices. Every step of his life, she had been there. Every wound, every failure, every dream, she had carried him through it. And now, tonight he sat at the head of the table, silent while his wife mocked her in front of everyone. Silence versus memory. The laughter at the other end of the table grew louder, covering the sting of what had just happened. But Evelyn's silence deepened. She looked down at her hands, at the faint lines etched into her skin from decades of work. Hands that had kneaded bread, stitched fabric, held her son through storms of every kind. Those hands trembled now, but not with weakness. With memory. With power restrained, because Evelyn knew something Clara did not. She knew about the clause. She knew about the envelope resting in her coat pocket at that very moment. Her silence wasn't just dignity anymore. It was preparation. And though no one at that glittering table knew it, the ground beneath them was already beginning to shift. The clinking sound rang through the dining room like a bell cutting through fog. Clara stood at the head of the table, wine glass raised high, her red lipstick gleaming under the golden light. For 25 years, she had carried that story like a shield. And now Clara held the truth in her hand like a weapon. Back at the dinner table, the murmurs grew. Did she really lie all these years? Whispered one guest, "Poor Daniel. How humiliating. Imagine finding out this way." The words swirled like poison smoke, each one wrapping tighter around Evelyn's chest. She stared down at her plate, unable to meet their eyes, unwilling to let them see the tears that burned just beneath the surface. Clara smiled, enjoying the ripple of chaos she had unleashed. "I suppose honesty has never been Evelyn's strength," she said lightly, as if she were talking about something trivial, like a misplaced recipe. "But Daniel deserves the truth, don't you all agree?" Evelyn clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to tell them the pain behind her silence. But the words refused to come. Daniel's chair scraped against the floor as he pushed back slightly, his face pale. He didn't look at Clara, he didn't look at the guests. He looked at Evelyn, really looked at her for the first time that night. His eyes were wide, searching, wounded. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice quiet but heavy enough to silence the room. Evelyn opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her throat locked, her heart pounded, her breath stuttered. How could she explain? How could she tell him that she had built her silence out of love, that every lie had been a shield to protect him from a truth too heavy for a child? Her lips trembled. She lowered her gaze, and in that silence, Clara's smile widened. The damage was done. Evelyn sat still, her quilt pressed tightly against her lap, her silence more deafening than any scream. The humiliation of the earlier mockery was now overshadowed by something darker, something far more destructive. Truth used as a weapon. And across the table, her son waited for an answer that she could not give. The room had barely settled from Clara's DNA revelation when she reached again into her bag, her eyes alight with mischief. Evelyn knew that look. It was the look of someone who wasn't finished, someone who had saved the sharpest blade for last. "Oh," Clara said with a grin. "And since we're sharing truths, I thought everyone might enjoy this." She held up her phone, swiped the screen, and pressed play. The dining room filled with the grainy glow of a video projected on the large television mounted on the wall. At first, the guests leaned forward curiously. Then they saw it, Evelyn, sitting at a small kitchen table, a single plate in front of her, a half-burnt candle flickering beside it. The date on the video, Christmas Eve last year, she was eating alone. Slowly, quietly. Not a gift in sight. Not a voice to keep her company. Just silence. On the screen, she raised her glass of water and a small, lonely toast. To no one. The room erupted. The laughter started soft. A few chuckles, the kind people try to hide behind their napkins. But then it grew. Louder, sharper, uncontrollable. Clara laughed the hardest, throwing her head back in delight. "Look," she exclaimed between giggles. "Our Evelyn celebrating all by herself. Isn't it just pitiful?" The word hung in the air, echoed by the laughter that followed. Pitiful. Guests shook their heads, some covering their mouths as if embarrassed, others leaning in closer to see the humiliating footage. The sound of clinking glasses, the squeak of chairs, all drowned beneath the chorus of cruelty. Evelyn sat perfectly still. The quilt rested on her lap, her hands clutched tightly around the edges. Her knuckles whitened, but she didn't move. Inside, her heart cracked, each laugh another fracture. But on the outside, she remained stone. She reached for her purse beneath the table, clutching it tightly against her side. Inside was the envelope, the silent weapon she had carried with her for years. She felt its presence, its weight. She thought of Anthony Wells, her lawyer, telling her, "The day they push too far, you'll know. That's when you use it." Her thumb brushed over the worn leather of the purse. She didn't open it. Not yet. For now, she sat in silence. Because silence was the last thing she owned in that room. The video ended. Clara slipped her phone back into her purse, still smirking. The laughter faded into awkward murmurs, but the damage had already been done. Daniel cleared his throat. All eyes turned toward him. He didn't look at his mother. Instead, he looked at Clara, then at the guests, then back down at his wine glass. "Maybe," he began carefully. "It's time we think about what's best for Mom." Evelyn's breath stilled. Daniel went on, his voice flat. "She's getting older. Living alone isn't good for her. Perhaps a retirement community would be better. Somewhere with people her age. Somewhere she won't be so lonely." The words cut sharper than any of Clara's cruelty. Somewhere with people her age, as if she were no longer family. As if she were an object to be relocated. The guests nodded politely, some even murmuring agreement. Clara placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder proudly, as though he had just solved a problem. Evelyn stared at her son. The boy she had raised. The man she had saved time and time again. The only child she had. And now he was handing her away like an old coat no one wanted to wear anymore. Something inside Evelyn snapped, not outwardly. She didn't scream, didn't weep, didn't storm out. Her face remained calm, her back straight, her silence unbroken. But deep inside, the last fragile thread connecting her to her son gave way. She had endured Clara's cruelty. She had endured the laughter of strangers. She had even endured the exposure of her most private truth. But Daniel's silence, and now his suggestion, was something else entirely. It was betrayal. It was abandonment. It was the final erasure of everything. She had been to him. She lowered her gaze to the quilt in her lap. She traced the stitches with her fingertips. Each one told a story of sacrifice, of nights without sleep, of love that had never asked for thanks. And in that moment, she knew. She was no longer Daniel's mother in his eyes. She was no longer family in that house, but she was still Evelyn Hart, and Evelyn Hart was not finished yet. The laughter faded, the conversation resumed, but Evelyn heard nothing. Her silence had transformed. It was no longer a shield. It was a blade being sharpened, waiting for the right moment to strike. And soon, that moment would come. The dinner had resumed, but Evelyn was no longer truly there. She sat in her chair like stone, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her mind already somewhere far beyond the glittering table. Then, with a slowness that made everyone pause, Evelyn reached into her purse. Her fingers closed around the smooth cream envelope she had carried for years, an object no one at the table knew existed. She drew it out and placed it gently on the polished wood, right beside her untouched plate. The gesture was so calm, so deliberate that it cut through the noise. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations trailed into silence. All eyes turned toward her. Clara tilted her head, curiosity sparking. "What's this, Evelyn?" she asked with mock sweetness. Evelyn looked up, her face composed, her voice steady but soft. "Just a thank you note." The words seemed simple enough, but the envelope carried more weight than anyone could imagine. Inside was Clause 27, the hidden provision of the Emotional Equity Agreement. Years earlier, Evelyn had sat in Anthony Wells's office and signed her name on the dotted line. That clause had been her invisible armor ever since, the guarantee that if she were ever humiliated beyond repair, she could reclaim everything she had given away. The room remained silent as the envelope lay there like an unspoken threat. Clara smirked, assuming it was nothing more than a sentimental letter. Daniel looked uneasy, shifting in his seat but saying nothing. Evelyn didn't push it. She didn't open the envelope, didn't explain. She let it sit there quietly, the calm before a storm only she could see. The evening ended in a blur of shallow goodbyes and false smiles. Evelyn rose from her chair, clutching her purse once more, and made her way toward the door. Just as she stepped into the hallway, a voice called softly behind her, "Grandma!" She turned to see Matthew Hart, her grandson, standing awkwardly by the staircase. He was Daniel's son, quiet, thoughtful, often overlooked in the noisy glow of Clara's social circles. Evelyn's lips softened into the faintest smile. "Matthew." He glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching, then stepped closer. From his pocket, he pulled out a small USB drive and pressed it into her palm. "I recorded something earlier," he whispered, "before dinner. Dad and Clara didn't know. It's them talking about you. Mocking you. Planning tonight. I thought you should have it." Evelyn closed her fingers around the device. For the first time that evening, warmth flickered in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice nearly broke, but she steadied it. "You don't know what this means." Matthew nodded, his young eyes filled with quiet loyalty. "I do." Later that night, Evelyn returned to her cottage at Willow Lake. The drive was long, the snow falling heavier now, but the sight of the small birch trees swaying by the water brought her comfort. She stepped inside, kicked off her boots, and wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The house was simple, quiet, nothing like Daniel's estate, but it was hers. And tonight, it felt like sanctuary. She lit a small lamp and set the envelope and USB on the table. Then she filled the kettle, waited for the whistle, and poured herself a cup of chamomile tea. The steam rose slowly, wrapping around her like a balm. Evelyn sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and slid the USB into the port. The screen flickered. Files appeared. She pressed play. Clara's voice filled the room, sharp and mocking. "Honestly, Daniel, the woman is pathetic. Did you see her last Christmas? Eating alone like some pitiful stray. Tonight will be perfect. I'll crush that ridiculous quilt in front of everyone. She won't even fight back. She never does." Daniel's voice followed, low and uncertain. "Maybe we shouldn't go that far," Clara laughed coldly. "Don't be weak. She'll be gone soon enough, and all this will be ours. Let me handle it." Evelyn sat still, the words cutting deeper than she expected. But instead of breaking her, they sharpened her resolve. Her hand moved slowly to the envelope. She opened her email client, typed Anthony Wells' address, and attached both the scanned clause and the recordings. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a moment, she closed her eyes and breathed. Decades of silence pressed down on her. Years of humiliation. Years of sacrifice unseen. Then she clicked send. The email whooshed away into the digital void, carrying with it the quiet weight of justice. Clause 27 was now active. Anthony would receive it by morning. The wheels of consequence had begun to turn. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, the quilt folded neatly beside her, the tea cooling on the desk. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar settle inside her chest. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief, it was power. She whispered into the silence of her cottage, her voice barely above a breath. They thought my silence was weakness. They never understood it was waiting. And outside, the wind carried her words across the frozen lake, as if nature itself bore witness to the moment Evelyn Hart finally chose to rise. The winter sun rose sluggishly over Daniel and Clara's estate, casting long shadows across the frosted lawn. Inside, the house was quiet, unnaturally so. Clara sipped her coffee in a silk robe, scrolling her phone with idle annoyance, while Daniel nursed a headache from the night before. Neither of them expected the knock at the door. It came sharp, deliberate, echoing through the halls. Clara frowned. Who could that be at this hour? Daniel rose, still in his slippers, and opened the door. On the doorstep stood a man in a dark coat, carrying a leather satchel. His expression was professional, neutral, the kind that revealed nothing but authority. Mr. and Mrs. Hart? The man asked. Daniel nodded warily. The courier reached into his satchel and withdrew a thick envelope sealed with a notary stamp. I've been instructed to deliver these legal documents on behalf of Anthony Wells, representing Evelyn Hart. At the mention of Evelyn's name, Clara's expression soured. What is this? More of her little dramatics? The courier ignored her tone. You'll want to read the documents carefully. As of this morning, all estate holdings, company shares, and liquid assets tied to Evelyn Hart's trust have reverted to her possession. You no longer hold ownership. Clara's coffee cup shattered against the marble floor. That's impossible, she snapped. This is our house, our company. She gave it to us. The courier adjusted his glasses. Yes, but you signed an agreement years ago. The Emotional Equity Clause, Section 27. It specifies that if Evelyn Hart is publicly humiliated, mocked, or disrespected, all assets are to return to her control immediately. She has now enforced it. Clara's face twisted with rage. That's ridiculous. You can't take everything away over a dinner spat. The courier remained calm. It was not a spat. There is video evidence. Multiple recordings. Legally binding. Daniel stepped forward, his voice tight. Wait, there must be some mistake. My mother would never... The courier handed him the signed, stamped documents. There is no mistake, Mr. Hart. Your mother already anticipated this scenario years ago. She left nothing to chance. Clara snatched the papers from Daniel's hands, flipping through them wildly. The words blurred before her eyes. Transfer of ownership. Forfeiture. Legal enforcement. It was no longer a symbol of humiliation. It was a banner of survival. Visitors stopped before it, running their fingers along the glass, whispering about its meaning. Evelyn always told them the same thing. This quilt is proof that even when you are stepped on, you can rise again. What is crushed can still be beautiful. The quilt became the soul of Evelyn's haven, a reminder that dignity can be repaired, stitched back together, stronger than before. While Clara and Daniel lived in isolation, Evelyn built a legacy greater than wealth or status. Her name became associated not with shame, but with strength. Reporters came eager to interview her. She declined most requests. She didn't want fame. She wanted something quieter, something real. Each night, as the women at Evelyn's haven laughed over dinner or shared their stories by the fireplace, Evelyn sat back and smiled. For the first time in decades, she wasn't invisible. She was seen. She was valued, and she realized that the justice she had claimed wasn't just for herself. It was for every woman who had been told to stay silent, to endure, to disappear quietly. Evelyn Hart was no longer silent. She was the voice others had been waiting for. The quilt that once carried shame now carried strength. And Evelyn, once pushed to the far end of the table, now sat at the head of a new one, surrounded by women who knew her pain and shared her hope. Her justice wasn't revenge. It was legacy. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. The farmhouse that had become Evelyn's haven breathed with new life. The old wooden floors creaked under the footsteps of women carrying baskets of fabric. Laughter echoed through the halls, gentle at first, like it wasn't used to being there, but growing stronger with each passing week. Evelyn often sat in the sunroom during the afternoons. A needle in hand, fabric stretched across her lap. Around her, women of all ages stitched quietly. Some hummed. Some told stories. Some just sat in the peace of silence, letting the rhythm of sewing heal the cracks in their hearts. Evelyn's hands guided them patiently, She showed a young mother how to patch a torn sleeve. She helped an older woman choose colors for her first quilt. She taught them not just how to sew, but how to breathe again. It wasn't just fabric they were repairing. It was themselves. Every Saturday, Matthew arrived, sometimes with a basket of groceries, sometimes with just his school books tucked under his arm. But always with a smile that reminded Evelyn of something she thought she had lost forever: loyalty in her bloodline. He helped set the tables for dinner, chopped vegetables in the kitchen, or simply sat by her side while she sewed. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the lake, Matthew looked at her and said, "You know, Grandma, everyone calls you the quiet hero online." Evelyn chuckled softly, shaking her head. "A hero? No, Matthew. I'm just a woman who refused to disappear." But Matthew leaned closer, his voice firm. "That's exactly what makes you a hero." She touched his hand gently. He didn't know how much those words meant. In him, she saw the seed of a future that wouldn't repeat the past. As winter turned to spring, Evelyn found herself reflecting more often. Sitting by the fire one night, she whispered into the quiet, "I never wanted revenge. I only wanted dignity," and it was true. Every stitch she had sewn, every sacrifice she had made, every silence she had endured, it had never been for vengeance. It had been for family, for love, for the hope that kindness would be enough. But kindness alone hadn't saved her. Dignity had. Choosing not to forgive the unforgivable had. Choosing herself had. One afternoon, a reporter came to Evelyn's haven. A young woman with a notepad, wide-eyed and eager. She asked to hear Evelyn's story. "People want to know," the reporter said carefully. "Was this revenge? Taking back your fortune, exposing what they did? Was it about getting even?" Evelyn sat in her armchair, the quilt framed on the wall behind her, the soft hum of women sewing filling the background. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the reporter steadily. "No," she said quietly. "I just stopped forgiving people who weren't sorry." The reporter's pen froze. Silence filled the room, the kind of silence that carried weight. Evelyn's words didn't need explanation. They stood on their own, simple and unshakable. That night, Evelyn stood at the window of her cottage looking out across Willow Lake. The water rippled gently in the moonlight. The world was quiet. She thought of the long road that had brought her here, the betrayals, the humiliations, the silence she had carried like a burden. And now, at last, the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, she whispered into the stillness. Words meant only for herself, but words that seemed to echo across the lake, carried by the wind. Sometimes the loudest justice is silence, followed by peace. And with that, Evelyn Hart closed her eyes, breathing deeply, finally free. And so, Evelyn's story ends not in revenge, but in peace. She showed the world that silence can carry more power than cruelty, and that dignity can outlive betrayal. Her journey reminds us all. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to stop forgiving those who are never sorry. If Evelyn's story touched you, remember, you are stronger than you think, and your voice, even in silence, matters. Thank you for watching. If you found meaning in this story, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Until next time. Stay strong, stay true, and never forget. Sometimes the loudest justice is silence, followed by peace.